Hello, everyone. This is Christina Barr, and you're watching Black Tea News. Hello. Welcome to Black Tea News. I am your host, Christina Barr, and today we're going to be talking about COVID, because why wouldn't we? I saw an interesting thread by Glenn Groenwald. He used to be part of The Intercept. Actually, he founded that paper. He ended up leaving because the people who were also editors, a part of that organization, that newspaper, did not like some of the takes he was giving, because he's certainly not someone who's just on the right or left. He's just someone who was pretty devoted, I guess, to the truth, like journalists are supposed to be. And they didn't like that he was being critical of Joe Biden. And so since he was no longer having the editorial power that he was supposed to have in an organization that he started, he went ahead and left. And now he writes for Substack, which a lot of these traditional newspaper people do not like Substack, because a lot of people are getting paid to write very well for Substack. And they're left with their smaller salaries in these industries that are really dying. A lot of print media is doing very bad. So he referenced some articles and did a thread on Twitter that I wanted to talk about, that really started highlighting and detailing when a lot of people lost credibility as far as COVID went. Now it started being politicized earlier. He specifically starts mentioning in June when the protests started. And so before, it was everyone stay home, the healthcare workers need you to stay home. And then all of a sudden there was a shift saying, no, this is important, you guys should go out and protest. So I thought it was important to go down memory lane, especially since we're starting to see a shift in the Biden administration. He said the other day, there is no federal solution, which I shared a funny meme on social media of Ronald Klein talking about in the past how, there basically is no state solution. And now Biden is like, it has to be done through the states. So definitely there's a big shift. I think it's political. They must know that the polling is horrendous for the president. And maybe they're starting to see they cannot continue down this path. We're seeing things like the CDC saying that 10 days, you don't have to quarantine for 10 days. They're cutting it down to 5. I had a big conversation with some of my relatives yesterday, like, why are they reducing it down to 5? I'm like, because they know that we're in a bad spot as far as the economy, and they acknowledge that people need to get back to work. And these were always bad policies. And granted, Omicron is a far less deadlier strain, and they don't have a way to stop it, but it is at least a far less deadlier strain than what we've had to face in the past. As a matter of fact, the symptoms of it are coughing, sneezing, etc. Just things are pretty much like a bad cold. But they recognize that people need to get back to work. That's really what this is about. Inflation isn't going away. At first, administration pretended like it wasn't going to happen, like it wasn't happening. Then they just pretended like it was just a temporary thing. And now we don't know how far into, obviously inflation lasted a long time this year, but we don't know how far it's going to last into next year. And so we have shortages on top of prices, food just being a lot right now, and gas being high. They tapped into our reserves, and they bragged because gas went down like 2 cents, which was a pretty amazing thing to brag about. And it was like the official like Democrats in like Congress, the organization that like helps to get them elected. It was them who put out the tweet talking about the 2 cents that you saved on gas. And I'm like, well, that's a terrible tweet, because if they're saying that they can save us 2 cents on gas, is it their fault that it's like $1 higher? Of course, Biden plays a part into that, certainly, on why gas is so high, but they have to determine when they're really going to take their victory. So we're going to be talking about COVID a bit today. I also want to go through this video of Nikole Hannah Jones. Now, this happened sometime last week, but of course I wasn't live last week, so I wanted to revisit it. I saw someone tweeted out like, oh yeah, she put Chuck Todd in his place because he was asking questions just to ask, because I think they are pushing like critical race theory and stuff. But there's people who are like, this stuff should not be taught to kids. And so she was like, we can't afford to wait. And she referenced critical race theory as if it were honest history. And of course, we know better here at Black Teen News. And I know that she knows better. And anyone who tells you that it's just about honest history is just honestly lying. So before we get into all that stuff today, I do want to encourage you guys to go to blacktnews.com, check out different articles I've written on the website, including different articles on critical race theory. There's an article that I wrote about, for example, the Kyle Rittenhouse case and what that has to do with critical race theory. There's like a real world, real time sort of observance of the ideology and how it plays out, because people are like, what does this have to do with race? Guys, listen to me. If you didn't hear this before, I've said this before, but let me tell you. My dad was over in Guatemala when he got acquitted. And so we were talking, he called me and we were talking a little bit about the case. And then he called me, I think the next, like a day later. And so, cause he read an article that I wrote that I shared, and he said he was unaware that Kyle Rittenhouse did not shoot any Black people. And I found that amazing. Now, my dad is not a consumer of left-wing news. Now, when you're overseas, like CNN is your is your choice, to watch. A lot of them watch, CNN and whatnot. So, granted, he didn't have his like normal news stations that he watched, and he didn't have the time to go through all the articles that he usually likes to consume. Like my dad would like read like 20 articles a day, like the headlines and stuff on like Drudge, which Drudge isn't what it used to be, but he's a consumer of information. So I just want to let you know that my dad is not a low information voter, but he told me that it's scary. And he doesn't scare easily. So I thought it was pretty powerful that he used the word scary. It's scary how much power the media has to make people believe that this was the case. And there were some articles where they actually did say that Kyle shot someone who was Black. And even after it was over, there was still that misinformation getting out. And so people didn't understand why it was so much about race, why they kept referring. Obviously, there were riots that night. People were looting and people were setting fires. As a matter of fact, that's when people started to chase Kyle, when he was trying to put out a fire. And people were very angry at one point because the judge wouldn't allow people to call them victims, because he said it was too much of a loaded term. Now, that wasn't specific to this case. That's just his blanket rule anyway. But they were assailants. They were not victims. They weren't victims. And they kept saying they were BLM protesters. Rosenbaum, the one who like had a history of like child molestation, he just like left a mental institution. Like he had nothing to do. He wasn't there for Black lives. Gage and other people, they I don't think they were there protesting because they love Black lives so much, especially when they were there to doing illegal things, causing trouble and whatnot. So it's pretty incredible still that the media decided to frame it a certain way. So you might be asking, why did they keep referring it to, they were there as BLM protesters? Because they wanted to, even though they can't convince everyone that these white men were Black, they had to at least make you believe that they were allies, and that's why this kid wanted to shoot them. And they did that because they want to remake a lot of our laws, and they knew that even though Kyle Rittenhouse, it was a clear-cut case of like self-defense, they didn't care. Neutral law isn't a thing that's supposed to apply to everyone, and it was worth getting rid of some of these institutions. And if it had to damage my right to self-defense, even though I'm a Black woman and he's a white man, if it had to damage everyone's right to self-defense, it didn't matter. So I break down that a little bit more. I did do a video as well. You guys can watch that at blacktnews.com. It's like 3 minutes long. Twitter, actually, not Twitter, TikTok took it down. TikTok took it down. I guess it was a little too spicy for them, but it was full of truths. and I did share it on like YouTube and Facebook, so you can watch like the little 3-minute video that I did about it. But I did write an article, and that's an example of something I have on blacktnews.com. So if you like the sort of things that I do, you can go to the website, check it out. But please consider leaving a donation at blacktnews.com/donate. I've we've grown a lot here. We've covered a lot of things. Practically every day, Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. on Saturdays, at 7:30 normally, but we haven't done it the past 2 weeks because it's the holiday. But we're coming back on the 8th, and I'm planning to have a really good guest for you guys. And we're going to have really interesting discussions as we talk about some of these like crazy viral videos on, TikTok, and just see how disturbing our world is right now. But we can fix it. We can fix it. That's why we're here. But if you appreciate what we do here, please consider leaving a donation. I thank everyone who's done that in the past, and I thank you for your continued support. Whatever you can do, $5, $10, $50, $100, whatever you feel inclined to give, I thank you for that. If you would like to look at different merchandise on the website, we have different merchandise as well, like the My Money, My Business shirt. You Are Not That Special got all other kind of shirts and mugs and so on, so you guys can check that out as well. And please consider just sharing the live. You can share this live right now. Please make sure that even if you watch this on Facebook, that you go and you subscribe on YouTube and other places, because one, that will help my numbers, but two, it would also open up different possibilities for what we can do in Black Teen News on other platforms as well. So please make sure that you're also subscribing and hitting notification bells on YouTube as well, even though I know a lot of you guys like to watch it on Facebook. And all my handles are at Black Tea News, with the exception on Twitter. On that one, it's at True Black Tea, but Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. And we've had a lot of growth. I'm at 84,000 followers on TikTok, and I just started this year. So it's a very good trajectory. And I love beating back some of the liberal nonsense. And I thank you guys for all of your support. So first thing I want to do, I do have a funny today. Now, I may have shown this before, but it's relevant now. Really relevant now. My friend George Alexopoulos, he did this comic some time ago. Now, sir, you're supposed to be wearing a mask indoors. Don't need one. I'm vaccinated. Thanks, though. And then she just goes AWOL. She just goes crazy and says, we're in this together. And it's kind of funny because if you know what George looks like, he kind of looks like the baby. He draws himself in sometimes into his stuff. And he's been doing political comics for a while. So people were pretty darn hysterical about these masks. Now, like I said, this one is an old comic book, but it's pretty relevant. And he reposted it recently because there was a situation where there was a woman on an airplane. And granted, I don't know what made them so nutty and crazy prior to what was recorded, but things were heated. And so there was an older gentleman, he was drinking something, his mask was down, and her mask was down as she was just yelling at this man. And so they were cursing each other out. There's no like heroes in the story, but she was deranged, yelling at this man with her mask down, telling him to take off his mask. And they're cursing at each other. And then she ends up spitting on him. The crazy person who wants him to mask up and is yelling at him because he's not masked ends up spitting on this man. So she ended up, being arrested when the plane landed. I don't know what's happening to her other than that. This ended where I followed the story, but the video was pretty insane. We have so many people that have just totally lost their minds in this COVID world. And now we have people beginning to admit, and there were like former Biden medical advisors that were saying that cloth masks don't work some time ago. A few months ago, I've played it on the show. I played for you guys Lena Wynn. She's on CNN doing analyst stuff, medical analyst. She said now she's admitting that the cloth masks don't work, that they're pretty much facial decorations. And the crazy thing about that is that's not stuff that people were saying before. Now, that's stuff that people have known for a long time. but that's just not stuff that people wanted to admit. So now we've seen this major shift. And Fauci and Rand Paul have gone back and forth head to head a lot on mask and other subjects like gain of function research as well. But Rand Paul will say, I've been infected, you've been infected. Like, why are you wearing the mask? This is just theater. And then he got so offended. It's fake outrage, but he said, I'm so sick of this. This isn't theater. What are you talking about? And then at some point of time, because at first Biden, when he got in office, he said we need 100 days of masking. That was what they were saying. I believe that they were just going to do the 100 days of masking and make it seem like we all came together and we all solved the crisis, and that's it. And hurrah, hurrah, hurrah! We complied. We did a good thing, and now it's over. And we can praise Biden because he showed true leadership. And he was saying, if we do this, then maybe you can have 4th of July. Maybe you can have 4th of July. And I'm like, well, I'm having 4th of July and I had 4th of July last year, and you're not going to like deter me from eating hot dogs and fireworks. Like you're not going to do that, sir. I'm not going to have permission to celebrate the 4th of July. It's just like not American. So, he went ahead and they started doing the 100 days, and they are really, really pushing about it. He did executive orders. So you had to wear the mask on federal land, even though his family like did not do that. Were caught not masked like during his like inauguration and stuff. So, that caused a little bit of a hoopla. Of course, not a large one because the media didn't really care. It was just kind of like right-wing people who cared, but they were setting bad examples, obviously. So eventually at one point, there's some kind of negative polling or backlash from like the public in general. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, let's get rid of the mask. We don't need the mask anymore. And all of a sudden Fauci wasn't wearing the mask. And then he went on TV. He literally went on TV and was like, well, people were seeing me with the mask, and I want people to see me without the mask and think it was okay to wear the mask. But now it's okay because now we don't need to wear the mask. That I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially it. I did do a video that I'll have to reshare it, but it was a before and after comparison of what Fauci said then to Rand Paul, and then what he said then, and then just really quickly a reminder of how fake these guys are. So it is theater, and I can understand wearing the mask to be symbolic and trying to be a good example to the people who you want to continue to wear the mask, but don't say it's not theater when it clearly is theater, because it was clearly theater. And that's also the same with like Biden versus Trump. Like Biden, he does not have the best hygiene when it comes to this stuff. He will clearly take down his mask, cough in his hand, and then pull back up his mask. He'll have his mask when no one's around, and then he'll come up, walk up to the reporters, and just take off his mask. There was a ceremony that had gosh, when was that for? Was it September 11th? Trump went to his like own thing, and then Bush, Biden, Obama, they were all together, and they all had masks on at one point, but other points they didn't have their mask on. So people are like, a lot of this is really, really, really a bunch of theater, and people know that. But Trump not wearing the mask, which didn't make sense that people were so outraged about it, because he got tested all the time. They say it doesn't protect you, and it stops you from spreading it. But if you don't have it, then you can't spread it, right? So if you don't have it, you can't spread it. So if he was tested all the time, he definitely didn't have COVID at times when he didn't have the mask on, then what does it matter that he didn't have the mask on? And so he's trying to portray this symbolic thing of, we can get back to life as normal. We should not be living in, we can be safe, but we shouldn't be living in fear. So he kept saying like we shouldn't panic, and he got in trouble a little bit, not a little bit, it was a lot, when he did those interviews. There was audio saying like, oh gosh, like there's like, it was really bad from his understanding, but he was trying to keep people calm. And that's what you're supposed to do in a situation like that. But actually hearing the audio, he seemed like the information that he thought was actually not accurate. So it was a good thing he did not make everyone panic. But on the flip side, Biden wants people to feel like there's a bigger crisis than what it is. And he wants this to feel like a thing that really isn't going to end, because it gives them more power. It gives them more leeway to do whatever that they want to do, whether it's pass astronomical bills, whether it's there's videos that I've shown before of Whitmer, Newsom, and other politicians, Democrats, saying that the pandemic is an opportunity to be able to push some of their agendas. I think Biden has said that as well on camera. So they know that this was a huge opportunity for them to reshape America in a lot of different ways. I believe that Trump's presidency basically ended the day they said 15 days to slow the spread. So I actually got into an argument with someone on TikTok because they said Trump was pro-COVID. I'm like, how are you? How, well, I won't say how are you pro-COVID, because there's definitely people who push and benefit from it. But I'm like, but I mentioned how 15 days to slow the spread was the beginning of the end for Trump. The economy was amazing. Do you guys remember how good the economy was? The economy was not only good, people were concerned about how good that it was, and there were analysts like, it's gonna fall, it's gonna fall. That's just what happens. It's just what happens, and it didn't fall. Unemployment kept falling, like, but the economy did not fall. It was still really good. It was still very strong. There was even people on the left who were saying they hope the economy crashes so Trump will not be president. Now, of course, that's psychotic. Of course, that is psychotic. That there are people who are willing to accept that sort of collateral damage just so Trump wouldn't be president. Now, what did Trump do that was so awful? That was so awful, especially prior. Now, if you're hysterical about the COVID stuff, you want to blame all the deaths on Trump. That's still crazy, but at least I'll just grant you that premise for a second. But we're talking about very, we're talking about super early, like when the economy was still really, really good. Okay, like because what was the end of 2019? People were starting to freak out about a little bit, and then like it started. We start really doing the lockdowns in early that year. So, if the economy was really strong, what had you upset about Trump so much? Because the Russia thing was a hoax, right? Some people don't know that, but it was a hoax. Like, nothing panned out from it. He didn't pee on Russian prostitutes. He wasn't Vladimir Putin's gay lover. The crazy stuff that people were saying, people believe, people were joking about. Adam Schiff's dramatization of the Ukraine call wasn't really a thing. The impeachment didn't go through, and they impeached him over the dumbest stuff too. Obstruction of Congress. There's 3 different branches, yo. They don't have to comply in the way that you want them to comply. They're different branches for a reason. Just because you can't get everything you want because you're a brat doesn't mean that you can impeach the president. I mean, you can impeach him for whatever reason you want. Doesn't mean it's legitimate. And obviously, he got acquitted on that, right? So what was it about Trump that made people so upset that they said that we would rather have the economy crash just so Trump wasn't president? So prior to COVID, when there were pandemics, people would normally try to live life as normally as they can. Be careful, but live life as normally as you can. As a matter of fact, there's an old video of Fauci. I saw it somewhere on social media. Maybe it was Twitter. It was a video of Fauci from a couple of years ago, and they asked, well, if there's some kind of outbreak, what are we going to do? Is everyone going to wear a mask? And what are we going to? He said, no, not wear masks. Just, don't drink too much. If you smoke, don't smoke. Like, exercise. Just like standard sort of advice that like you might hear from Joe Rogan and a lot of different people. It wasn't, let's lock down our lives. It was, try to resume it as normally as possible. So that was the thinking behind these things prior to COVID outbreaks. And then Trump, granted, I don't begrudge him. I don't begrudge him too much, but I don't think lockdowns were ever a good thing. And I don't see Trump ever like saying differently, because ultimately he pulled the trigger and he doesn't go back and really have regrets like that. So I don't foresee him like saying, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. But he got such incredible sort of hysteria from advisors telling him that potentially we could have millions of people die. So you're the president of the United States. You're very green, like you've been doing a pretty good job, in my opinion. But he's never had to hold this sort of power where something like this would happen. And people are telling that millions of people could die if they don't lock down or if they don't take measures. And they're telling them in like best case scenario that if they do everything right, that still like hundreds of thousands of people will die. I believe those were like the original sort of numbers that they were throwing out there for the projections. So that's what they tell them. And then they start locking down. And then people realize the lockdowns are a very good way for Trump not to be president at the end of 2020. Like I said, people like Whitmer and Newsom, and I think Biden too, people were saying there's a good opportunity to push forward their agendas. Obviously, it disrupted the economy. At first, I was very optimistic myself because I'm like, okay, some of this stuff sounds bad, but it sounds like they have a plan. They have a plan with getting the vaccine together, which, you take it if you want to take it. They had the people making ventilators, they had people making masks, like people were on it and they had a plan. The governors were saying that Trump was doing a good job because Pence was doing a good job. Pence was over it. They had the meetings every day. But at some point in time, the media really, really decided to pull the trigger first. The media was the ones who decided to pull the trigger first. They would go to the governors, they go to Cuomo, and they go to Newsom, and they'd say like, "How's Trump doing? How's Trump doing?" And they're like, "I know you guys want us to rag on them, but they're actually giving us everything we need." But then eventually, you saw a shift start happening, and people got really, 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 really negative with Trump. The media was already negative anyway, but they were really, really negative on him. He was getting blamed for every death. Cuomo was the one they were uplifting. People were saying they're Cuomo-sexuals in New York, and in Florida, Ron DeSantis was the devil. And if you decided to have any sort of freedom, let people decide, let people live their life sort of mentality, you were bad. And the people who were locking down, making their constituents hysterical, and even encouraging them to go after other people, then you were the good guy. Like in Michigan, I can tell you our governor exercised a tyrannical amount of power, and she used powers that were deemed that were inappropriate, and our Supreme Court ended up ruling on that. But even when they started drawing back her powers, they decided to start using the licensing agencies. And so they said, well, if you guys don't comply in the way that we want, enforce these sort of rules, because we had some police that were just like, we're not doing all the stuff. This stuff is, we've got other things to worry about. We're not going to show up just because someone doesn't have a mask on. Okay. So we had some good police officers and sheriffs that were just like, we're not going to just do your bidding like good little dogs. Like we're here to uphold the law. And these are just edicts. They're not the law. So she would tell the restaurants and so on, well, you guys have to enforce this stuff. And if you don't enforce these different measures that we want you to enforce for safety, then we're going to pull your licenses and you won't have a restaurant. You won't have a business. And so I remember when everything was closed down, there's this local restaurant that I really like for going for breakfast. And so we made sure to order from them, and we were really hoping that they survived through the pandemic. And so when they first started opening restaurants up, I saw someone mention that you have to wear a mask and then you can take it off in the restaurant. And I'm like, that's so stupid. That's so stupid that you have to wear it until you get to a booth. And I thought that was a joke. And then I walked into the restaurant and they're like, you have to wear your mask. And I'm like, I'm just going to take it down when we get it off, take it off when I get to the booth. And they're like, we need you to do that. And I look around, I'm like the only customer, and I'm not going to be the only customer because two of my sisters are coming in, and I'm looking around, and then I see just the fear, the visceral fear in this poor hostess eyes. And she says, we just don't want to get shut down again. So I went ahead and put on my mask, and I'm making eyes like this is crazy. And then I walk like not even 6 feet away to where I'm sitting down. And then I remove the mask. And of course, everyone is aware of how ridiculous it was. but they had to enforce these ridiculous things. I guess they didn't technically have to, um, but that was in their best interest at the time. Now, I hate um, that our elected officials really use the people to turn against each other so they can have an excuse to go do whatever they want. What cracks me up sometimes when I do videos, like I did one um that's doing pretty well on TikTok, and I talked about it yesterday about how Democrats rely on their voters being emotionally charged rather than factually informed. And sometimes I'll get comments that are like, "It's so funny that you guys pick sides and you don't realize they're all the same, and they just want us to be divided." And but sometimes you'll have like a socialist or somebody say something like that, and I'm like, "We're not on the same side, sir." So I'm sorry, like you're part of the bad team as far as I'm concerned. We're not gonna come together and unify over you trying to steal all my money because you don't want to work. I'm sorry, that's not how it works. um like and I do understand that people try to turn people against each other, but I think there's a team that particularly benefits. Now, are there people who move and work beyond the teams? Like teams don't matter to some people? Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, but when it comes to like the sides of like who's liberty and who's pushing it, like there's a difference between red states and blue states. And you can listen to Bill Maher and say he said red states are a joy, blue states are a bother. So, and there's some issues where there's a particular team who is being really, really, really oppressive with the liberty. So our governor was pretty awful, and there were lots of governors who were awful, but she was particularly bad. Um, Now, one thing that we got to do that I guess didn't happen so much in other states was that we could still have our churches open. But there are people in Michigan who are unaware of that. But the churches were technically exempt from um, fines and whatnot. So we probably wouldn't care it anyway. We still would have had church, but we had church the whole time. We never closed down our church, and I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful for that. But I want to talk about this Glenn Greenwald thread about when there started to be a shift, because people were saying people weren't just using businesses to turn against the businesses against the customer, um or police, where people were like back the blue, and all of a sudden there's some police officers like arresting people. I saw one video of a police officer pulling up at a house questioning a mother because there was two kids not from the same household playing with each other. I mean, people got into some really nitty gritty, ridiculous stuff. I saw officers writing out tickets to church people for listening to church in their cars, like on AM, like radio, like low bandwidth. They were just parked in front of the church, and they were issuing out fines, and pastors and stuff were arrested. So there was some really crazy stuff. They lived off of us being divided against one another. They lived off that. But they really used medical professionals, and they had medical professionals saying, "Hey, please, we're working out here. We're risking our lives. Please stay home." And they really tried to guilt you out of your liberties and to convince you that fighting for your bodily autonomy, um, it's funny they don't want your bodily autonomy to apply to COVID and stuff, but they want it to apply to like abortion, that even though that is directly affecting someone else's life, which would be the baby. But they don't think they shouldn't respect it out of with COVID. Now, granted, you can spread it and there are people dying from it, but that is a far less likely possibility from you catching COVID and dying from COVID than a baby being aborted. I mean, abortion is obviously more fatal. So we're talking about like bodily autonomy should really apply at least to the COVID stuff, especially since they don't have a way to genuinely stop the spread of it. People are still spreading it. So you taking the vaccine for yourself is really more of a you protecting yourself issue. And the only reason why people are still spreading like that you have to get it and you have to mask up and all that stuff is because like it's a religious practice basically at this point. But they were weaponizing nurses to trying to make you feel bad about exercising your liberties and your rights and so on. And there was a really big shift, a huge shift when after George Floyd was killed. And after George Floyd was killed and they started doing the Black Lives Matter protest, um, everyone was locked down. We had so many crazy rules. We had a rule in Michigan where you couldn't travel between different residences. Like if you had a house in the southeast and you had one up north, like they said you couldn't travel between houses, and you couldn't invite like people outside of your household into your house and stuff. Then we had a bunch of crazy different rules that were just up a wall nutso that really infringe on people's liberties. But then all of a sudden one day, hey, hit the streets, protest, do as you please. You don't have to do the stay home nonsense. So that was at this point, that was when a lot of people were seeing that there was no sincerity in this. And even a lot of medical professionals were really being driven by dogma. So, so this was an interesting thread, and I wanted to make sure that he got some credit. Again, Glenn Groenwald, he used to be part of the Intercept, but he ended up leaving the Intercept after they did not like his information on Biden. Like they were really trying to limit what he could say, and since he didn't have the sort of discretion that he was supposed to have, he ended up just leaving and writing for Substack. But he talks about how this was a pivotal moment in the pandemic's history. For 4 months, the message was clear and unrelenting. Everyone must stay home. Those who leave, even to go to a deserted beach, are reckless sociopaths. And it flipped overnight, which is true. Which was true. So we have white coats for Black lives. And so you've had medical professionals out there marching. I remember there was this, there was a letter signed by, I think, over either 3,000, 5,000 medical professionals saying that the protests were too important and to not let COVID stop them. And so he goes on to say that, this single-handedly destroyed trust in public health officials, and corporate media celebrated douchebag lawyers shaming families at deserted beaches, then overnight cheered densely packed street protests. A lawyer dressed as Grim Reaper is haunting Florida beaches to protest their reopening. Oh my gosh, I forgot about this. People did the craziest things. People did the absolute nuttiest things during this. Dozens of public health and disease experts have signed an open letter in support of nationwide anti-racism protests. And they said white supremacy is a lethal public health issue that predates and contributes to COVID-19. Isn't that wild? Isn't it wild that they would say things like that? And COVID-19 was, I mean, you have minorities who are more obese on average than, I guess, the average white American. So they would be more at risk. But it is amazing that they talk more about like getting the vaccine and staying home, wearing a mask and stuff, which the mask, of course, don't. If you're just wearing cloth mask, doesn't work. The medical masks that you wear, it says right on the box that they don't protect you from COVID. So they would push these things that either don't work, or they would push the vaccine so tough, even though they know minorities do have a healthier skepticism about that sort of stuff, whether it be just history or I don't know, cultural conditioning. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure. But they didn't really push for people to get healthy and exercise, even though they know that that is a problem area, and probably why one of the contributing reasons why, if there's disproportionate numbers of people being impacted by COVID in the minority communities, then that would be it. And now you have minorities who don't want to take the vaccine. Like I said, they have a healthy skepticism, whether it's because of things like the Tuskegee experiments or whatever. They don't care. They still want you to take it, and they'll like call the police. In New York, they had police that were arresting people for going into Panera Breads and Burger King and kicking them out for trespassing and not showing their vaccine passport. And you've had like Black Lives Matter and other groups still protesting in New York and other places because they feel like their liberty is being trampled, but they don't care because they still wanted to push it. And so here's another interesting that Glenn said. He said in June he was drafting an article about how politicized the COVID messaging was. And then in The Intercept, the editors there began to write their own article talking about how racism was the greatest health crisis, so everyone should go protest. So that's what I guess he started writing, and then the Intercept had their own article to push a different message to I guess block him, karate chop him. That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing. And so people talking about racism being a huge health crisis during this time, um, what people were pushing and making so everyone so hysterical about wasn't really the reality. And I have a graph that I've shown you guys before, but I'm going to show it after I get done with this thread. But I do want to mention George Floyd. Of course, we know that Derek Chauvin was ultimately found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. However, race did not play any sort of role in the trial. They could not prove that it was a hate crime. They did not mention it. And they brought up that they did not have the sort of evidence for it being a hate crime. So it's amazing that our country was so captivated by this narrative, yet there was no evidence for what they pushed. Let's go on. California blue state protest, almost everyone there was in a mask. Oh, that's someone's thread in talking about it. As usual, institutions, media, government, public health authorities love to whine about the refusal of public to their trust pronouncements, complaining people turn on other to less credentialed and worthy sources, but they never ask what they did to cause this. This is really true. And even though other people did show up and they were masked and they were outside, there are people outside protesting against lockdowns, but they still hated them and didn't want them to do that either. In Michigan, we had a really huge protest in Lansing. It was Operation Gridlock, and they told people not to get out of their cars, or some people got out of their cars. But I knew people who had COVID and they had it pretty bad, and later their family, they had someone else in their family who had it pretty bad. But they were still protesting at Operation Gridlock. And people were just in their cars creating like a huge amount of traffic. It was pretty extraordinary to see. Now, we did not start doing civil disobedience like that until the rules in Michigan got really, really dumb. Of course, people would still go in stores and not want to wear masks. Like, people were doing that. But to the big things that started happening, one protest after another, that really didn't start happening until we got dumb edicts like, if you're already in a store, you can't buy non-essential items. Like, some stuff had to be like sectioned off, like seeds. Okay. Or my sister always complains about paint thinner, for example. Now, paint thinner, that's essential to her because she's an artist. You know, so that's part of her job, her livelihood. So saying that that's not essential and that has to be like marked off, you know, that she can't go in the store to get that of course was annoying to her. So that's an example I always remember. But then there was also like, if you want to go out in the water, you can bring a canoe, but you can't be in a boat that has a motor in it. So once the rules started to get really, really ridiculous to the point of people could start seeing that it was not about the science, that's when the civil disobedience started. And some civil disobedience is okay, is warranted, you could say. But people were just in their cars honking their horns. And so the media really tried to push back. They were saying they were blocking a hospital that was there, but they weren't really blocked. That was just like outrage that they said they're pushing back. But people were really upset because there were people who went out on the lawn that were outside. Now, they were outside still. Okay. And the masks, we know, don't work, regardless of whether they were wearing them back then or not. Maybe you think that they should have worn them because everyone was like being told that they should wear them. They weren't. Some of them weren't wearing masks. Some of them were, but they didn't work anyway. So hindsight, what's it matter? But there are other people outside protesting who would lecture those same people, but they went out and they did the Black Lives Matter thing. So once people decided that they could pick and choose when COVID was going to show up, that's when people were like, this is ridiculous. And some people decided to start taking their lives back, but of course we still have people to this day who are like, I'll take as many boosters as I'm told. I will wear any masks that I need to, and they will feel righteous. And even if they have to spit on people who are unmasked, not even unmasked, just on an airplane, have their mask down for a little bit while they're drinking water, they will do that. This pandemic, Elon Musk has mentioned, he was a person of the year, by the way, that this pandemic has given a lot of people an excuse to be bullies, to be really mean to each other. And that's what we've seen time and time again. People are not in their right minds about it. Let me show you this graph before I move on. I've mentioned this a lot because this was Skeptic Magazine did this, and so this is how many unarmed Black men were killed by police in 2019. So as you can see by this graph, the more liberal you are, the more off you are about police shooting statistics. So you can see, so the correct number is about maybe it was about 14. I know it's like less than 20 in 2019, right? So the people who got that most right are people who are like very conservative. But there's people on this chart who believe that the answer is more than 10,000. More, even there's conservative people like I know 4% isn't a lot, but that's still a lot for that number, I think. But the majority of people on the very liberal side believed that the number was about 1,000. Now that's really off. And even the people who thought it was about 100 are off. And then when it gets to the liberal side, that's really high as far as people thinking it's 100. But they got people almost 8% who believe that the number is more than 10,000. So if you are this off about this police shooting statistics of unarmed Black men, perhaps that is why you are so heated in about this topic. Perhaps that can explain some of the hysteria. Now, of course, some people don't really care about the hysteria, and some people really need to feel like they're needed and like they're doing something important. And if you can hold a sign and go to a rally and feel like you've really did something, or you block out your social media profile and you put in a black square, and that's all you have to do to feel like a hero, why not give people that complex? um so there's some people who just did it for virtue signaling, sure. But a lot of people, I think, especially when the looting really started happening and stuff, people were just a part of that, not really for Black lives. Now, there are people who I know who participated in those rallies and stuff, and they're good people, maybe a little some in some regards misinformed, but but most regards people just doing what they felt was right at the time. But a lot of people were extraordinarily misinformed about this subject, and I gave you just an example right there that showcases a little data on it, that a lot of people are unaware of the actual numbers. So I'm not saying police brutality and people being shot by police, especially if it was unjustly, and just because you're unarmed doesn't necessarily mean that was unjust either. But if you it goes back to what I was saying yesterday, and I mentioned briefly today. Democrats really rely on their voters being emotionally charged rather than factually informed. And so obviously a lot of people were not informed, right? Or they were misinformed. You had people saying stuff like, this would have never happened if George Floyd was white, even though there's a young man named Tony Tempa who is no longer with us, who would, but if he were alive, or like his relatives and other people, at least who saw the video when he was suffocated, would beg to differ. Okay. So it's amazing that this can't unite people. I don't like Black Lives Matter. And I've explained it at length in other times. I'm not going to go in it today too much. But I don't like BLM. And when people would ask me, well, what's my alternatives? I would say, go talk to a libertarian leaning Republican. I promise you they are more informed in this issue than a lot of these activists who are just really emotional trying to push stuff. And as a matter of fact, BLM, a lot of stuff they want to push at the end of the day doesn't even have a lot to do with police brutality. A lot of them really just want to promote LGBT stuff and communism. As a matter of fact, their founders are trained Marxist lesbians. And if you want to support LGBT stuff, that's fine. But I don't think that's why a lot of people sign up for it. Like I've heard of people trying to go to those meetings, and then they're like, "We didn't even talk about Black Lives Matter stuff. Like we just talked about gay stuff." And so it just throws people off. I'm sure when they get to the nitty gritty of some of the stuff. They're what we're about page was pretty wild. They took it down, but it was wild. So I'm not a fan of BLM, but if you go to some libertarian leaning Republicans, they are very informed on their rights and they will inform you on your rights. And those are the people you should hook up with. What's really amazing about the Kyle Rittenhouse case is that it was so divisive, especially how the media drove it. And it's still pretty divisive because the right is like championing Rittenhouse, not because he's some person particularly be glorified, but they feel like, haha, we won because you guys are trying to destroy this kid because of your narrative, and your narrative failed. Therefore, the media failed, the Democrat establishment failed. So, haha, this is our victory. So we're gonna brag about it forever. So that's why he's like being hailed everywhere. There's some people who are like who maybe are uplifting this kid, but I think that's really what it boils down to. But really, in a sane world, a sane, justified world, the two sides should be able to come together about this because obviously the system ended up ultimately working for Rittenhouse in the end. In the end, but he was viciously prosecuted. And if people can see how blatantly he was targeted, even though there's all this information that he should have been able to get off or not be charged at all, but they still went after him. And Binger had the dumbest arguments going after this kid. You could play Call of Duty. Like, why were you urgent? He's like, there's a fire. And he's like, so why did you feel you need to run? Because there was a fire. It was ridiculous. You watched the trial, just how the case of the prosecution was making was utterly absurd. So if people on the right can see how the system went after Kyle, this was an opportunity for the left to say, look at what they did to your boy. And if they could do this to Kyle, and this is a high profile case, what do you think they're doing to people who don't have money, who don't have fame, people are trying to meet different quotas or whatever? Now, I actually think we're at a time now when a lot of people want to get people out because we just have a lot of people who are doing this justice reform thing, and they look at different people's colors and they're like, oh, there's too many black people in here, so let's not prosecute too many people. And it's like, why don't you just like focus on whether or not they did the crime, sir? So we're in a bad kind of spot with that right now. However, they could still try to make their case and say there's a lot of people who are innocent, who are viciously prosecuted. Maybe they did something, but maybe they got harsher penalties than what they could. Maybe they did a plea deal with something they didn't do because they knew that they couldn't. There wasn't, stuff that they didn't have enough help to get out of it. And Kyle had all this help. He really benefited from the fact that there was so much footage that night. And kudos to independent media. That's the power of independent media. If there wasn't so much independent media and people who were willing to get up and take Ubers all the way to Kenosha to take video footage, this kid probably would have been convicted and gone to jail, honestly. But there's plenty of evidence. But there's a lot of people who don't have as many eyeballs and voices on them like Kyle Rittenhouse's case. So if people can do that to Rittenhouse, who's to say that they're not doing it to other people? So people on the left who are like, we need some kind of reform and we need to look at the criminal justice system, because obviously there's corrupt people who will go after you for political reasons like they did with Kyle. Obviously we all saw on a national scale. So this should have been an opportunity for people to join together and say, you know what, you are correct. We need to look at these things more closely. Now, that does not mean we just let people out of jail. That doesn't mean that people are like no bail and other stuff. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that there could have been middle ground if there wasn't other plots afoot. If we didn't all hate each other so much, or particularly that the left wasn't so vicious with this, that they could have actually made some progression. Tammy Bruce who's on Fox. She used to be she's a lesbian, and she used to be the head chapter of Now, which is a big feminist group. The chapter like out in California. I think maybe it was the LA one specifically, but it was out in California. So she was a big feminist. And so she decided to leave the left because she realized that they don't actually want to solve problems. They're not looking for solutions. They're just looking for more problems, more grievances. And so once she realized that she didn't want to be, I guess, that petty, and she wanted to be productive, then that was a time to really start leaving the left. So I think that's something that a lot of people have realized and been red pilled about. And people are continuously looking for problems instead of solutions. And like I said, they could have bridged the gap with a lot of people on the right if they were being strategic and if they really cared about their mission, and it wasn't just a means to an end. And with a lot of groups like BLM, Marxism is the means to end. And I know that's a buzzword to a lot of people, but the founders are literally trained Marxists. That's what they said. That is what they said. I didn't make that up. So I talked about that for a long time today. So I didn't really get to the Nikole Hannah Jones thing. But I want to get to that really quickly. I'm going to go a little bit over because I do want to talk about this really, really briefly.
To think
at what age?
And I wouldn't want my
Is there an
child
age restriction in
to
your
go
mind?
to a school.
You know, there's this
About teaching what?
Teaching sort of when it comes to teaching our past. You know, there's this, and I think it's just coming basically through a racial lens. But there's this, you know, parents are saying, "Hey, don't make my kid feel guilty," and you know, and I know a parent of color is going, "What are you talking about? You know, I've got to teach reality." When do you do it, and how do you do it?
Well, I think you should just think a little bit about your framing. You said parents, and then you said parents of color. So the
right, white parents and parents of color.
White, right,
fair,
white
fair
parents
point. Yeah.
are not representing. As a matter of fact, white parents are representing fewer than half of all public school parents,
right.
And yet they have an outsized voice in this debate. I have a child who, just by watching the news when she was 8 years old, she saw Laquan McDonald, a teenager in Chicago, get shot 16 times by police on CBS in the morning show. And she asked me, why did they kill that boy? So I can't wait to have these conversations with my child. Right. And I don't think that we should be asking what is the appropriate age. I think we should be asking, what are the appropriate conversations at that age? But our children are being raised in a racialized society. They are noticing things, they have questions. And I don't think teaching an accurate rendering of history is about making white children feel guilty. I don't know an educator. I've been covering education for 2 decades. I've never seen a teacher of any race tell a white child, you are responsible for what happened in the past. I just don't think that that's happening. And even all of the people who have claimed that that has happened have not been able to produce a shred of evidence that that's true. I think some students who are white probably walk away from some of these lessons feeling very uncomfortable, as we should. We should be uncomfortable with the hard parts of our past. And
okay, I'll go into more depth about this tomorrow, but I just wanted to say that this woman is a liar. This woman is a liar. Okay, so for those of you who don't know Nikole Hannah Jones, she's one of the people behind the 1619 Project. She won a Pulitzer Prize. Of course, the 1619 Project has been refuted by many historians, and they're saying that the United States was actually founded upon slavery the day that the slave ships landed on our shores rather than in 1776. So they're trying to restructure the founding of America. And so you can say it's an interesting premise, but it's absolutely untrue. And so they've had to make different corrections and so on, but they still gave each other Pulitzer Prizes so they could incorporate this stuff academically because they want people to think of America as this racist, awful, terrible place. And of course, there's checkered bad history. There's stuff presently that's awful. I think our attitude toward abortion is horrific. And I hope in 100 years, people look at us today at disgust like we look at slavery and stuff with disgust and can't. But say, how could this have happened? I can see how it happened, because when you dehumanize people so you can exercise your privilege over them, you can start to rationalize anything you want to do. So 1619 Project. So she's pushing this thing that is not true. So that's her claim to fame, really, and why people are always talking about Nikole Hannah Jones, bringing her on to stuff. She claimed that she's not aware of any parents, any students telling children or whatever that they're guilty for stuff of the past, and that people who claim that that's true don't have any evidence. That's not true either. People have been suing different school districts for having material that said precisely those things, and has been evidence. I've showed some of that stuff on my show before, and if you follow Chris Ruffalo, he's someone who provides evidence after evidence after evidence on these things. He keeps really up to date with a lot of this critical race theory. It is like his mission in life to basically destroy it and bring it down, and he does not hide that at all. And I commend him, because I do think it's an evil ideology. We talked about that quite a bit yesterday. So people also who claim that critical race theory, anyone who tells you that critical race theory is about teaching accurate history, it's either because they don't know anything about it, or they're just liars. Okay, it's one of the two. Either they don't know anything about it, or they're lying. And this is a quote from Words That Wound. And this is a book that Kimberly Crenshaw, she's one of the authors on it. And she's one of the people who's like held as accredited as like making it. Joy Reid has her on her show quite a bit. But critical race theory is grounded in the particulars of a social reality that is defined by our experiences and the collective historical experience of our communities of origin. Okay? So there's nothing objective about that. Critical race theorists embraced subjectivity of perspective. Embrace subjectivity of perspective. Okay? So not objective truths, subjectivity of people's perspectives. And this is a really important part, and are avowedly political. Avowedly political. That's critical race theory. That is critical race theory right there. So that's what I want you guys to be aware of when people talk about it. It's not meant to be honest history. And people who tell you that it's about teaching honest history are lying to your face. Absolutely lying to your face. So I don't appreciate women like Nikole Hannah Jones, who's supposed to be a journalist of the New York Times, claiming that anything like this is about honest history. And she's someone who's not a purveyor of honest history either. Sometimes I'm aware that it is difficult for people to learn about different things. My sister, she has a mixed family. And sometimes she's like, she asks people advice for how to explain different things that they cover and they talk about, and how you break it to kids about certain things. But history is history. And teachers should be able to teach dates and times and locations and events without necessarily spilling all of their emotional baggage all over the place. And there is a way that you can teach history. Like especially when you get into college and they teach history, they also teach the way that people were sort of thinking and the bias that would also be behind it as well. Because history is written by the victors, I guess. But it should be really more simplistic when you're in middle school, high school, even in elementary. It should be far more simplistic, and people are making it really complicated. And people are like, well, there's so much stuff that people have to learn. There's only so much things you're going to learn in a public school system. A lot of stuff that I know about history, I learned that out of school on my own. There's only so many hours in a day that I would want to be in a school. So many people want to pack stuff in there. It's not that they want them to be more educated. They want them to be indoctrinated into their worldview. That's what it's about. We learned so many things in school. But there's so many things that I learned out of school, particularly about Black history, that I'm like, man, I like, on one hand, I wish I would have known, but at the same time, how much are you going to stuff in a school year? How much you're going to stuff in a school year? But these people who want to teach critical race theory, it's not about accurate history. And 1619 Project, what Nikole Hannah Jones, isn't about accurate history either. So when people like her are like, oh, we got to have these conversations, and these people who claim that kids are being taught, these white kids are being taught they're evil, that's not true. There's been plenty of evidence. I've seen it. I've covered it on the show, and maybe we can go a little more depth tomorrow. But I am out of time. There's this crazy story about a CNN producer that actually there's been 2 CNN employees that have been arrested for like sex trafficking and other kind of stuff. And one of them worked for Andrew Cuomo, and one of them worked for Jake Tapper. And Project Veritas had some pretty crazy video about it. So if you guys haven't seen it, go check that out. I think I retweeted it. It's pretty darn wild. It's pretty darn wild. The sort of stuff that's coming out. I don't think, and he did resign. The man who was like being charged about right now has resigned from CNN. I don't think Jake Tapper said anything about his producer though. And why would he? Why would he? But if it was on Fox, they'd want Fox people to say something about it. So I'm just put that out there, guys. I'm gonna put that out there. So anyway, we'll also get to this story with the governor kidnapping plot. I did share it on my Facebook page, an article that BuzzFeed, of all places, has been reporting it pretty in depth. But a lot of people, there was a plot to kidnap Whitmer, and it was a big political story last year. And a lot of people involved were informants. And it kind of seems like it would not have necessarily happened if not for the FBI. So the men involved in the case are their lawyers are trying to get it dismissed, saying that they were entrapped. Now, I think they were obviously entrapped. I don't know if there's going to be enough evidence for them to get off scot-free. There are people who tried to make that case in the past, and didn't bear any fruit. But I think they were obviously entrapped. Doesn't mean that they're good people. Doesn't mean that they did good things, but it does mean that the government didn't trap them. So we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But I did post that article on my Facebook page if you guys are interested. But like I said, BuzzFeed broke down a lot of interesting stuff about it. It's, at least at the very least, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's an interesting case. I know one of the lawyers who are defending one of the guys who's being charged right now. So it's pretty interesting. It's interesting watching his feed. He's been on the news a little bit. Maybe I'll have him on. I know Facebook doesn't like him too much. wonder if my live would survive if I had him on. But pretty interesting story. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If you don't mind me sharing your tweet, your comment, but thank you. I appreciate the compliments. If you guys enjoyed the show, please go to visit blacktnews.com. That quote that I read from critical race theory, it's from a book, but I did include that in my article about the Kyle Rittenhouse case. So if you haven't read those sort of articles, make sure that you guys check that out. Make sure that you guys are sharing them around. Make sure you're following me on my social media platforms. Like I know some of you guys like watching on Facebook. Please subscribe on my YouTube channel as well. All my handles are at Black T News on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. The only one that's different is at Twitter. That one's at True Black T. Please go to blacktnews.com. If you enjoyed what I did here, please make sure that you consider leaving a donation at blacktnews.com/donate. I appreciate all that you guys do. And I will see you tomorrow. God